My sense is that, as you said, this will be interactive, and so as we've got stories, they go back 15,000 years, if not more, and we're going to squeeze it all into about 60 minutes or so. So it's going to be a lot for us to hopefully hit on the right topics that interest you. But please, if there's a lead that you want to follow and ask us questions about, please do. So anyway, I'm David, and
I'm Joe.
We are the past president and the current president of Nolambika. So and this is why we kind of have this logo up here. This slideshow that I put together refers back probably to the topic you'd be interested in, which is Lifeways, the loss and renewal at the falls and in the central Connecticut River Valley. So that's what we're going to talk about. Joe is going to share a little bit of what his perspective. If you want to start with the topography right away, or if you want to talk about your collection of books, whatever you feel you would like to do, Joe.
Let's get the books out of the way.
Okay.
So I have my book collection is probably, I don't know, my history collection is about 200 books. But what I'd like to say is that you can gather information about your local history from a lot of sources. There are local writers, and we have David Gracie and Bud Driver put their research together in a wonderful book called Standing on History. And one thing I'd like to mention is there's no one book that can speak authoritatively about the history all around in our area. And so what I've learned is it's a gleaning process. And you go to either extremes on your research in history, and then you come together somewhere in the middle or slightly left or right, and you're going to be in pretty good shape for getting an appreciation of the magic of living in this place that you live. And it is absolutely magical. And the more you learn, the more that magic will come alive every day of your life. And every morning when I get up and I look out over to the west, over the Great Meadows by my property on the Connecticut River, I ask myself one fundamental question: am I being a good ancestor? And I ask that question because I want my grandsons and all the children to come for 7 generations and more after us to have a body of knowledge and to also have an appreciation of this place we live in, and to take it with them no matter where they go, anywhere in the world. And it's pretty magical. So let's get through the books real quick. There are a lot of wonderful books that you can get access to. Here's another one, The Falls Fight. It doesn't have all the story, but it has enough of the story to get you thinking. And wonderful author William McLeish. He lived most of his time up in Charlemont. He's the late William McLeish now, but he wrote the book The Day Before America, and I've had it for a number of years, and I cracked it open about 2 weeks ago and said, yeah, my gosh, David, William, he spent some real time trying to get the story right. And he talks about the giant Indian on the Mohawk Trail, how out of place it is, and it's quite interesting. The Flow of Time in the Connecticut River Valley. Leon Weeks has this book on. This is going to touch base on the ancient Lake Hitchcock and the glacial movements and what have you. Dinosaurs, dunes, and drifting continents. And I have a story about the dunes part that I think is absolutely amazing. I want to relate to you later. And this is Richard Little. And he's just a wonderful teacher. His work over the years has made a big difference. Here's my history of Northfield, Temple, and Sheldon. It's disintegrating. I can't get through this book without marking page after page after page. But bear in mind, this book was written from a Eurocentric viewpoint. But what they were looking at was they were looking at 1875. They were looking at the landscape in the Connecticut River Valley, in Deerfield and Northfield and Hatfield and all around, as they saw it at that time. And we have to rely on them because they were the eyes and ears and feet on the ground at that time for a part of the story, but only for a part of the story. New England Outpost, Richard Melvoin, a lot of, I just barely scratched the surface. Volume 1, if you want to know early history in this area and get a sense of what at least the Eurocentric viewpoint is, Volume 1 of the Pioneer Valley Memorial Association, Volume 1, History and Proceedings. It's the same thing with this book. I just mark it all over the place. There are other ways to acquire a sense of history. In 1892, the Centennial Gazette, Greenfield Gazette, published this particular book here, looking back 100 years. So they were looking at what they published on the day that this book was published in 1792, and those editorials were looking back another 100 years before that. So if you want to get a sense of maybe what was going on at the Great Falls, because some people say that the salmon never were here, and these interviews by the old-timers who were around harvesting those salmon before there were any dams on the Connecticut River knew they were here. Things like this are a wonderful way to get access to some of the stories. You can also go to the Library of Congress, and I have a box full of original documents. This one is the inhabitants of Brunswick, Maine, that the Southern Indians may not be removed from their present place of abode without their free consent. This is the U.S. Congress. They wrote what they were talking about. They didn't know how to lie about it. Doesn't mean they made the right choices. But here it is. This is the stuff. You can read this. You can go on the Library of Congress and start reading about what the heck happened to the indigenous people. It started here in New England. It started right here where we are. And it moved west and north and to the coast. And the process, some of the stories are not very pleasant, but this is one shot at they were trying to protect some of the indigenous people of Maine. You can find it in the artwork. Wheeler's Surprise, August 2nd, 1675, 1 month to the day before Northfield was attacked during King Philip's War. And we had the privilege of working with, do you remember which butt is David's? David Tall Pine White.
Yeah.
I believe this butt right here is David Tall Pine's White. This is a wonderful piece that was created by Russell Buzzell. He's a wonderful artist, and Wheeler's Surprise is one of the early attacks of King Philip's War, where the indigenous people were trying to get a handle on the encroachment into the land that they needed to survive on. So you can get it through art, you can get it through the writings of local books. There's a lot of wonderful every town in the valley, I believe, has a history of Hatfield and Northfield and Deerfield, So if you look around, you'll find them. And it wasn't hard for me to collect over 200 books, and a lot of my books are pretty broad and diversified, but I've always been thinking about, where did the corn come from and all that stuff, and what were the similar shared lifeways of hunter-gatherer peoples. They shared very similar lifeways with European peoples of that time period. It's really interesting about the ceremonial stone landscapes that exist all over North America, and we have become really acutely aware of them here in Western Massachusetts. This may be the hotbed for actually getting those kinds of sites recognized in the United States. And then you can, when you're fortunate enough, you can get into the archaeological reports, which are illegal for you to have or see, and which is a real shame in a lot of ways, because if you could read what I read in these reports, you would just be astounded at why people aren't really standing up and saying, wait a second, before you destroy that place, let's understand what happened there. But we don't, because we are not allowed to understand what happened there. And that breaks my heart. But when you can get these, and maybe you can inherit them from somebody, and you start to read them, they'll broaden your sense of things. And I have just so many books, and David does as well, So there's no one book, there's no one compass heading on this. As a human being, you know what you've experienced in your life to get through your daily process. Indigenous people have been experiencing the same kinds of things all over the world forever. And once you can connect that tissue and understand that you're living a life now in a society and in a culture that you function X, Y, and Z, and people in the early times were functioning in their societies not so differently, but they had different values and they had different resources and they had a different way of appreciating them. And so books, don't rule out any book that you might get your hands on that might give you, even if, I always say, if I find one page in a book that teaches me something where I go, wow, then it was worth reading that book. I don't have to memorize every page in the book, but what it's like is dipping a candle. Knowledge is like dipping a candle up and down and up and down, and all of a sudden you have something substantial. And then you strike the match and you light that wick and you shine a light on things. That's what knowledge can do. And that's what trying to glean a little bit here and a little bit there from all these different writings is all about. Do you want to talk about?
Yeah, I just want to, what we were, Joe and I were thinking of ideas for how to approach this history talk right now. And the way it came out in terms of phrasing is, what happened here, what is happening here, and why should you care? Some people that we have met could care less. Other people are incredibly drawn into the history here and the story of what happened. Joe touched on it in that this is a very magical, spiritual place, always has been. We're talking about the falls, or by extension, what we used to call, or we still call, Canada Hill, Wissatinawag, all the way out this way to Sachem's Head and beyond down to Mount Sugarloaf. This whole area drew people for thousands, if not tens of thousands of years. So we're in a very special place, and it's going to be challenging to read 200 books, but you could talk to people like Joe and me and kind of get a good inkling of what happened here and why should it matter. I mentioned Canada Hill. I talked a little bit, I have a slide with some place names. You'd be astounded. The names that were given by tribal people to places that are very familiar to you, but they all had a very poetic, sometimes very practical meaning. A beautiful native word might just mean a rocky place in the river or good place to cross, but it sounds really great. For example, I mentioned Canada Hill. Canada, and I learned this from Howard Clark, Canada basically means village. Nothing to do with the country up north. Canada means village. So what we are protecting, Dorothy, Joe, myself, Howard, is an ancient site. 10,000 years ago, people were living there. And so not too many people know that. So I guess what we're going to try to do tonight is just to bring you into a little bit of the knowledge that we have, and hope that you'll have some questions. So if you could advance the slide one bit. And now this is, Joe is going to talk to you a little bit about Lake Hitchcock. Are there people who know a lot about Lake Hitchcock? Can you show us? Or a little bit about it? A little bit. Okay, good. Because this is like the reason why, we're here. I mean, why I'm here, what drew my family to this area were the events that happened after this lake started disappearing. So, Joe, you want to take us back 15,000 years a minute?
Sure, yeah. As you're looking at this, you're looking south on that. So normally when you look at a map, you look north.
Yeah.
That's Mount Sugarloaf down there.
So you can all see the outline of the shore like that, okay?
Where's
So-
Mount Sugarloaf? Oh, I see.
Yeah, Mount Sugarloaf, you can see that up here. Lester Garvin from Shelburne Falls created the computer program that gave us the first true glimpse of the the ancient Lake Hitchcock. Now bear in mind, 20,000 years ago, we had over 5,000 feet of ice grinding its way down through, and it's not the first time that the glaciers have moved through this part of North America, grinding its way down through the valley and just scouring the landscape. Now, the next time you go outside and you drive down Route 91, you look up at Mount Sugarloaf or whatever, you look around or you go over to Barton's Cove and you look to the hills to the east and the hills to the west, you're going to be looking about like this. The next time you get out, I want you to tip your head back 45 degrees and look like this and pretend you could see the tops of a 25,000 foot mountain. We have some of the oldest mountains in the world here that have just been absolutely demolished by glacial events over the years. So Lake Hitchcock, when the glacier receded, an environment started to create itself. And remember I had said earlier that I have a little story about dinosaurs, dunes, and drifting continents. Dunes, sand dunes, they're the result of the exposed lake bottom, but I don't want to. I'd like to read just one short page here by Dr. Dina Denkhaus. She's Department of Anthropology, University of Massachusetts, 1984. She has since passed, but this is a piece of history about what you're looking at that you're never going to get to hear from a scientific standpoint, the way that she writes about it. So really quick, continental ice sheets, glacier, a mile or more thick, moved over the Northfield area several times in the last 500,000 years. Geologists are able to identify only 2 such movements in southern New England, but evidence from elsewhere strongly implies a larger number. The glaciers in Northfield scoured the hills, loosed the rock soil, moving on consolidated materials southward. So they were moving, everything's moving southward. The softer rocks of the valley suffered. That would make sense. They got crushed quicker and easier, but they became part of some of the richest farmland in the world here. We have the 3rd richest farmland in the world in the Connecticut River Valley. The rocks suffered from attrition as the valley was deepened to below depths reached by the river channels. Real quick, I'd like to point something out here. My property is right here, and it runs right on the shoreline of ancient Lake Hitchcock, right up and down to here. Now, I was with an archaeologist 2 weeks ago up here for the Shell Bridge project. I said to him, I want you to look 30 feet northeast of where you are right now, because that is the shoreline of ancient Lake Hitchcock. And he looked at me and smiled. I said, so we are in, as far as habitation goes, this is where the oldest stuff from human contact period of human beings being in the valley, this is where the oldest stuff, archaeologically speaking, will be located. 20 minutes later, as I was talking with some other people, he tapped me on the shoulder and he brought me over to the hole he was digging. It was about 40 centimeters down. Right there at the bottom of that hole, which wasn't that deep, was the blue clay of ancient Lake Hitchcock. He had hit the shoreline bottom of the shallows of Lake Hitchcock, and that all happened right about here. So for me, I get up in the morning, I look out my window right here, and I look over at King Philip's Hill over there, and I know that I used to own waterfront property. But anyways, not anymore, but who knows what things are changing. So this is, I don't want to get too far into it here, but she talks about how in the middle part of Connecticut, the natural earthen dam the glacier had scoured up all this debris and created a natural dam. And that's what created, as the meltwater came in from all the tributaries, that's what created this incredible ancient lake. But there was one more earthen obstruction, and that was at the Lily Pond, which everybody knows exists in Barton Cove. And there's an interesting story about the archaeology discovered on that, and I'll get to it in a real quick second. But that also was an obstruction, and so it forced the riverbed that was trying to find its own existence into a very contorted fashion, where it had to come over the plunge pools and drop down into the Lily Pond area, or Lily section of Barton Cove. That earthen dam gave way, and it gave way all at once. And when it did, the river as we see it today started to get more of its own character. But with it, it brought environmental changes to both the eastern and the western shoreline, and that's what drew people here. But the story behind it is, there was an archaeological dig for Wemco about 1971 over in Gill, Massachusetts, and Peter Thomas was in charge, the archaeologist in charge of that dig. They had discovered a smoking pit, fishing where you would harvest the fish and you'd smoke them to save them, to get you through the winter months. And they went down, and they only had that one summer to get there. But in the process of getting down, and they quit about 9,000 years. So they know it, and there was still charcoal in the pit. So they had gotten down through 9,000 years. But at about 7,000 years, they hit a section of debris, of silt debris that interrupted the charcoal. The charcoal layers were constant all the way down through that archaeological dig. But at about 7,000 years ago, they hit that material. And it's speculated that's just about the time that that earthen dam gave way, that was forcing the Connecticut River flow to go over the plunge pools, which is where Barton Cove is now. It was on the east side of the river that natural earthen obstruction occurred, but it gave way all at once. And bear in mind now, there were people on both sides of the river living their lives there, right on the river's edge when that happened. So you can imagine that there might have been some serious loss of life. But further downstream, where the Deerfield River runs north, and it's very unusual for major rivers to run north, but the Deerfield River runs north, and it catches up and interrupts the Connecticut River. The material from that 7,000-year-old event went down 13 meters. And when they hit the 13-meter mark, they hit a brand new horizon. And what that means is they hit the ground that people were walking on and living their lives on prior to that 7,000-year-old event. The reason why the difference is above the dam in Gill, the material left only encompassed about 6 inches, as in common language we'd say, 6 inches of material. Down below at 13 meters of silt built up there. You can envision this major water event pushing that Deerfield River north up against the Connecticut River and just forcing these two bodies of water to come together and hold and suspend all this material which settled out in the area of the Kells Farm, which is on the Greenfield side of the river there. Pretty interesting that archaeology and science can come together and say, hey, guess what happened to these poor people 7,000 years? Pretty amazing.
Can I jump in here?
Yeah.
To what I would talk about is kind of a time lapse. Is it okay if I walk around?
Yes.
I'm used to teaching 30 kids and I can't sit still. So, and the French part helps too. You can move. But to do a kind of a time lapse thing. So Joe talked about Rocky Hill, Connecticut, where the natural dam had been formed. The glacier about 14,000, 15,000 years ago started melting. This whole area filled up with water. And then around 14,000 years ago, when the dam broke, all this drained out. So what occurred, what the archaeology that has been done, you're all familiar with Mount Sugarloaf at the head right here. There's a lot of archaeology when this was dry, lowland vegetation. They found the very first remnants of a hunting camp 13,500 years ago. So we basically scientifically place the first Paleo Indians coming into the valley. Now, our Narragansett friends say we've been here for 30,000 years. Haven't found any vestiges of that, but they have the history and the oral tradition that goes way back. But we have documented photographs of material that was found at the foot, because this was, if this is all gone, this was a migration route for caribou. If you can picture that coming down through Greenfield. So they were being channeled down. This is tundra, channeled down through Greenfield, over the meadows here, and going towards Mount Sugarloaf in the gap to get down to the lowlands. And those first hunters were installed there in a hunting camp and a choke point. And they left tools behind, they left projectile points behind for the archaeologists to find in the 1980s and 90s.
Yeah.
So those, we're talking about then the first peoples that we know of have been able to prove were here, who turned up. And then from there, we move into various other phases of early archaic and woodlands people, but we know more about the woodlands people than we know about the earlier phases, and it's kind of artificial to call it that anyway. You might have followed a current event of the Rotary in Northampton and the big hoop-de-doo about trying to preserve that. You all know that story? So right next to the River Valley Co-op, there is a traffic issue. The state, in their wisdom, decided that they would create a rotary. You know what rotaries are like? They love it. Very fashionable right now to have a rotary instead of a stoplight. So anyway, in doing some work, the archaeologists that were hired by MassDOT, Department of Transportation, found remnants of an early village. And the landowner kind of objected to having to lose that land, and they found a lot of objects, very important, important artifacts. Then what happened was the feds are supposed to follow, and this was important for our history here, and Howard was involved with that, Joe was involved with that at the Turners Falls Airport, but there is a section of the National Historic Preservation Act called Section 106, which means that if you have any federal money involved, you've got to have federally recognized tribes with eyes on the digging that's going on. The feds didn't do that. So the River Valley people heard of Nolambika Project, and they called me up. And the woman, Rochelle Prunty, who takes care of a lot of the workings of the River Valley Co-op, asked me what to do. And I said, well, Joe had been involved early on, and I called the federally recognized tribal officer who was in charge of this area, and he called the feds rather, and they were being forced, the upshot is they were forced to follow that Section 106 with the Narragansetts and the Aquinnah Wampanoag from Martha's Vineyard eyes on the thing. The latest chapter is finally the state and the feds backed off. They're not going to destroy the rest of this site. But it was an early archaic site, of which there were about 3 in New England.
10,
we don't know much about it.
About 10,000 years.
Yeah. So we don't know that much about early archaic. We don't know hardly anything about paleo, except there's a major site in Turners Falls. But picture a couple thousand years later, different people with different tools and different hunting materials showed up. So we're starting to get to relatively familiar territory for you, in the sense that you know that this is an important place. You know that early paleo people came to this land in at least 13,000 years ago. And we know that because we have found artifacts at Mount Sugarloaf and at the Turners Falls Airport and upriver, like Joe was talking about. This is an incredibly attractive spot. The lake dries, and then what happened to the beach sands?
Yeah, so what you end up with is a tundra environment. wonderful tall grasses, just what these caribou. And woolly mammoth and mastodon also, but they tend to want to eat the conifer trees, but these are their environments, and so they need to move north to south, south to north, north to south throughout their seasonal migrations in order to get to their breeding grounds, and then get back to an area where a climate that they can make their way through the winter time. And so people don't have a real grasp on what was moving down this valley at that time, but we're talking caribou herds 500,000 strong. At the same time, bear in mind, a few thousand years later, we had passenger pigeons flying through this valley, millions and millions. They would darken the skies. But the caribou would move through. Now, what was going on with that site that was discovered at the Rotary in Northampton was there's a place called the Honey Pot just down over the hill by the Connecticut River where there's another one of these choke points. And so what they discovered was an encampment probably visited on a regular basis to take advantage of either the southward or the northward migration of the caribou at that choke point. The distance between the Connecticut River and the Hudson River is 50 miles. That 50-mile stretch of landmass is considered a paleo corridor. It's an incredibly powerful historical area. And when the caribou were on the west side of the river, which is where that encampment was, they didn't have a lot of choice. They had to stay down in the prairie area near the river, and they were choked in there. So they were coming through as shoulder to shoulder. And these paleo people would climb up onto a rock that got named Judith's Point, I believe. But long before Judith came along, they were up there watching the caribou herds down below. They also needed the ledges that existed there to get themselves out of the hard wind of the paleo environment. These winds were moving 30, 35, 40 miles an hour all day long. And in order to retain their heat source and keep their energy up, they had to get out of the winds by the end of the day when the sun went down. And they were using those ledges for that. So the environment that Lake Hitchcock created and the Connecticut River created, it created the environment that people needed to live and even thrive in. And that's what David and I are working our way toward.
And what I was getting at too is when the lake dried out of beach sand and the wind blew. And so they created these dunes, if you can picture that. Now, if you go out into the Montague Plains, where there at one point there was some excavation going on for sand and gravel operations, there are clamshells out there under the surface. All of that was windswept and dunes. Joe told the story about finding, So we got to keep an eye on our time because we spent a lot of time about 15,000 years ago. Do you want to tell that story about
real quick
the dune?
So about 15 years ago, the farmer across the street from my property decided that he would get a bulldozer and illegally level out the land that he wanted to grow potatoes on. So he got out there for 2 days, it was late November, with his bulldozer, and he bulldozed down these ancient sand dunes. And I thought to myself, whoa, it's a good thing that the state, the archaeologist doesn't know about this, but I went down to take a look, and what I found that was at the bottom of that dune that he bulldozed was a fire pit, this big around, with charcoal and stones on it, and the blue gray clay of Lake Hitchcock. It was under that dune, which means somebody visited that land before, mind you, before it was true tundra. Mm-hmm. They got themselves out there to take a look around. They built themselves a fire, at least for one night, and then they hightailed out of there. Then the high winds and the sand dunes came in, and then the vegetation that the caribou and such needed to survive on came in after that point. So that's pretty interesting. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And we know that 13,000 years, in what we call the river bottom land that we see all up and down the valley now. So pretty old.
That's the slide, yeah. So, as we leave Hitchcock, you all know how come it's called Lake Hitchcock? The professor who was a professor of geology, born and raised in Deerfield, got to be the first state archaeologist of Massachusetts. And when he was growing up here and moving around in Deerfield, he would, I mean, you can do that now. When the leaves are down, you look and say, boy, that looks like a shoreline over there. Joe mentioned it. And you look over towards Amherst and Shutesbury and you say, wow, that looks like a shoreline. And so he kind of speculated that there had to be something here, because we're in a place where there are terraces. You know, if you go up through Northfield, you're going to be on the most recent floodplain, but as you go, you see these terraces, and that's up on the top there is where the oldest stuff is. So anyway, Hitchcock was speculating about that, but he was in business around the 1850s, 1860s. Sometime in the 1930s, a professor of geology said, wouldn't it be nice to call that ancient lake after the guy who thought he had figured it out? So someone gave this glacial lake the name of Lake Hitchcock. So it wasn't himself. He didn't name it like Champlain named Lake Champlain for himself or something like that. But this was not Hitchcock himself. But he was a pretty important person in those days, born and raised in Deerfield, and made it to be the first state archaeologist. So I put up this slide. This is moving forward way beyond the Paleo times, but just to give you an idea of what tribes are in the state here, they're in the Northeast. A word about tribes, and because we'll talk a little bit about that in a couple of minutes, but I have a lot of anthropologist friends, and maybe Joe has a point of view. The word tribe and the designation of people who are in tribes is kind of a European construct. The people knew who they were, they knew where they lived, but the English had a hard time figuring out who was who, so they had to start categorizing in order to take the land from them or find somebody who would sign it off. But a lot of times, and check me if I'm wrong, people took their names from the topography, from the area where they were. So it turns out that in Deerfield and in part of Greenfield, what we call the Deerfield River now was known as the Pocumpetuk, meaning Abenaki, meaning a shallow, sandy, winding river. So the people who lived in that vicinity were either given the name or were assumed to call themselves Pocumtuck. So that's one of the reasons. My person, the tribe that I have descended from was designated by anthropologists as the Western Niantic. Niantic is a corruption of Nahantic, meaning people who live at the point. So basically, that's where that came from. And going up the river, you've got, in our area, you've got Agawam, right? You've got Nonotuck and Norwatuk. I think you've heard those names. They're still lingering in the landscape. And up here where Joe lives, the old name was Squaquig, which was a English corruption of Sokwakik, meaning the place of the people who separated from the Abenaki. So they are Abenaki, but they extended all the way down. The Abenaki are all the way, St. Lawrence River Valley, all the way to the Maine coast and up through Nova Scotia. They all have different designations, but they are one great Abenaki or Wabanaki group. So the ones who separated came down to Sokwakik and built, Joe knows more than I could ever imagine reading about the foundation and the fort. He's explored the old forts and things like that. But just to give you an idea, we've moved away from the Paleo times where these were people who hunted mastodon, hunted caribou, and we're now into a period of time where the populations of indigenous people are growing, but in balance with the environment. They had a way, using medicinal plants, of controlling the birth rate, and they also lived in balance with their resources. So it's a pretty good-sized population before the epidemics hit. So I once heard in some of the stories about one of the environmental impact reports that they did at the Torrance Falls Airport. If you can picture between Albany and this part around Natick, and from in the Connecticut River Valley slightly towards up to Brattleboro, there are about 76,000 people living in this area for over 9,000 years. That's where the book Standing on History comes from, in the sense that people were all over here, lived and used in balance, reciprocity with their resources here. The population was big, but it was not so overwhelming that the resources were exhausted. But you can see, this is in the handbook, Smithsonian Handbook of Northeastern Indians, and they have sections for the whole country. But this whole valley was just tribe after tribe, or let's say clan and family, extended families, all the way up to the St. Lawrence and beyond. So we kind of jumped ahead, but I jumped into the place where these groups have names, but I think it's important for you to know that. I'll just say that the Pocumtuck, as far as we know, the name came from Pocumpetuk, which is this river, and they were the leading group of an association of a number of tribes in our area. So they were the heads of related groups called Nonotuck and Norwatuk, this meaning the middle land, right? The middle land of the valley. Typically, Norwatuk has something to do with the current situation of Hatfield, Hadley. Nonotuck typically refers to Northampton, unless I've switched them around. Agawam is name of a group, and that would be the people of the meadows here. And you get down to places like the Tunxus and the Podunk. Each of these had a name for themselves, but they recognized each other. They knew who they were. They were basically in association with the Pocumtuck from Deerfield and parts of Greenfield. These people were incredibly powerful. They were in conflict a lot of times with the Mohegans. They did not like the Mohegans. You all heard of Uncas and the Mohegans. That really exists. They oftentimes were down on Long Island, fighting against the Shinnecock and the Montauk. But the people in our area were incredibly powerful, and they were stewards, if not owners, of most of the lands that we have here, from at least the Pocumtuck, from Mount Sugarloaf up to the falls, at the Great Falls at Wissatinawag and Peskiomska. And we have some stories about what happened then, but y'all see where I'm going with that? So just to try to give you a primer on some of these things. Joe, do you want to jump in before I do some place names?
So, Day Before America, 357,700 people in the Northeast. Now, I'm going to do a disclaimer on this after. 19 people per 100 square meters. These are the statistics as assumed prior to the 90% loss when the plagues came through. There were two plagues that moved through, 1613, 1630. And Northfield certainly got hit by the 1630 plague. And if we ever get the opportunity to come together again and talk about in more detail some of this stuff, I will show you some physical remains of a couple of women who knew each other and probably died in that plague. So I've got your curiosity sparked up a little bit there, and I'm hoping we can get together at another time. But, so, 357,700 people, that's 10% of the people that were really here in the Northeast at that time.
So our friends tell us, the Narragansett and the Wampanoag will easily explain, we were in rough shape and there was no one left to fight to save the land, to protect the land. 90% of the population was gone, as you've probably heard these stories where people, were not even buried. Nothing was, they just were bones on the surface.
In the woods.
And the pilgrims saw that. So, yeah.
Before the plagues, I'm wondering what the relationship, you mentioned that there was some fighting or some animosity between, but aside from that, what were the relations of group to group? Was there much interaction?
I can give you what I have gleaned from reading all these books and talking to people, and Joe has certainly got a point of view too, but essentially, it's my understanding that, first of all, and I'll get to that in the next slide, but the people that lived in this northeastern part of the country were all of an Algonquian linguistic and cultural group, which was different from the Iroquoian. So we got a major cultural and linguistic issue there and difference in attitude. So essentially, relatively keeping an eye on their agriculture, incredibly rich lands, as Joe said. By the way, I always pointed out, I do a guided history walk down on Old Deerfield. We just opened 2 weeks ago. But I do remind people that women invented agriculture. And it's worth saying. The men were off fighting, fishing, hunting, things like that.
Playing games.
Women stayed and developed the agricultural practices that we know. It was not you would not get a man out and hoeing the rows of corn. The children had their jobs, but the women were responsible for this huge undertaking and incredibly successful.
Yes.
This developing of the concept of the three sisters, of the complementary beans and squash and corn, all that's a woman who did that.
The manuring of the hills.
Yeah. So, but to get back to the business of conflict,
Well, it wasn't really conflict I'm asking about, but wondering about the non-conflict.
Essentially, the non-conflict.
Counting coup was about the average conflict.
Yeah.
It was really more about
playing lacrosse and
Oh,
played pretty rough.
playing really rough.
But
Bone-breaking rough. But
one of the things that the falls that Wissatinawag and Peskiomskat was very important for is it pulled a lot of family groups together. And what did they come for? We know they came to fish, but they also came to go to the Montague Plains to get medicinal herbs and ceremonial herbs, but they also, and we stress this a lot, came to find a spouse. Because if you are a Narragansett coming into Pocumtuck territory, being welcomed, of course, and you see a Pocumtuck man that you really would like to hang out with, that's a good thing, because then the Narragansett and the Pocumtuck are joined together by kinship. So you have a stressful time, you go to your in-laws' house. Or if a woman decides that she doesn't want this man anymore, he hits the road, she stays. The woman in a matriarchal society, the clan mother, the children are born into her clan. The men came and went, and it was, pretty much accepted. Like I said, they were out hunting, fishing, fighting, and whaling. So sometimes these guys would be gone for 7 years. And in the meantime, if another man came along that was going to provide better for the woman of that clan, then, that's it. In my own family, it's really crazy because my Narragansett and Nahantake ancestors, looking into the genealogy, you have families. One particular ancestor, a woman, had two children who were white, two who were clearly native, and another black or two. So the men came and went, and it was not like this whole Puritan, issue of guilt. It was practical. It was practical. If your man was gone, or if you didn't like your man, then you could say, just go away. I'm taking somebody else. And so you had a blending and mixing of family, clans, and groups and colors. So that was huge. Being able to leave a spot where there was potential conflict and just go to a different place, because conflict served no purpose. It was not a thing that you wanted to do. Obviously, there was stress between some of these big groups. Certainly, the Iroquoian and the Algonquian. We all know about the horror stories of the Mohawks, and but they came and went also, and they got chased out of the valley more than once. So anyway, like I said, there's so many stories that we could share.
Well,
Go ahead.
Just real life anecdotes. I mean, I walked those fields that have been plowed for 1,800, worked for 1,800 years, plowed for the last 300, but worked for 1,800 years. And the artifacts I find are children's toys.
Huh.
Yeah. Huh. It's the women who are out there with their infants and their children. And a lot of these children's toys were trade items that were brought in from Glasgow, Scotland, and from England and other places. And they were ceramic dolls and such, and a lot of children's toys. And I have a whole collection of ceramic dolls that came from cornfields.
Mm-hmm.
It's because the native women were out there with their children.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that made the Pocumtuck, who actually called themselves the Hurricanes, according to Bud Driver, and I don't have a reason to disbelieve him. Pocumtuck is what the English assigned them for a name. They called themselves the Hurricanes.
Say that again.
The Hurricanes.
Oh, or,
But one of the things that made the Pocumtuck and the Squaqueak so powerful was the amount of food they could produce in a given season. I mean, these women could plant hundreds, and my property overlooks 350 acres of farmland that's been farmed forever. Those women could farm that 350 acres, the women of Pocumtuck. Now, bear in mind, when the gatherings come together at the Great Falls, they were looking for a mate, but they were also looking to trade. Maybe they would bring beaver skins down, and they wanted to go home with some of the lithic material from this area, and maybe they wanted to go home with some corn seed and see what they could do, and lots of food and lots of exchange of ideas and culture, and so that was considered a place of peace, the village that David and I have put so many years into making sure stays preserved. It was a peace village.
Mm-hmm.
It was a peace village because the natural resources the Creator could take away if the energy and intent of the resources the Creator gave the people were misused. And so everybody understood that when they came there. We set aside our quarrels. We come here in peace. Maybe we can heal, maybe we can intermarry and create better bonds. Resources. We had a lot of resources up and down the Connecticut River. We had the corn, beans, and squash. We had fish. We had the nutting hills. We had what David said, the natural resources of, in the case of Northfield, Hell's Kitchen across the way, those swamplands that just loaded with natural medicines that could be utilized for all kinds of things. The Jack in the Pulpit to take care of strep throat and all kinds of things. And we had the natural storage of protein that they could put through the winter in the form of chestnuts and walnuts and hickory nuts and abundance of that stuff. So life was good. The average indigenous person, particularly the males, they could work to 2 hours a day. And as Henry David Thoreau said, and own their own home, where the Irish would have to cut ice from Walden Pond and just about starve to death with their families because they never owned their own homes. Indigenous people owned their own homes and they were warm and comfortable. But the point is, hour and a half a day. What culture do you know nowadays that could work an hour and a half a day and live a full, rewarding life? To the point where they created all kinds of games, including in some of the stuff that David talked about. They had time to spend with their children. They had time to play games with each other. They had time to exchange ideas. And if someone important they know passed away 1,000 miles from where they are, they would walk that 1,000 miles and bring something from their home and leave it with those people to pay homage to them. They were walkers, incredible walkers. And so how can you do that? You have a balance in life that works for you. You have the resources, you have the family networks, you have the ability to move through different cultures and manage to get along because you're all trying to survive under similar or certainly challenging conditions. It may differ, but you all understand that. This is an amazing stretch of land down through the Connecticut River Valley for cultural people.
Right. And before we go to the next slide, then what Joe was getting at, I mean, we're really, you and I, Joe and I, and probably you if you've been out in this region, are really connected to the rivers. I like to say, what river is your address? And if you think about this, you've got the falls, right? But you've got the river I live on is called the Pagwag. We'll talk about it, which is the Miller's River. But you have the Miller's River. You have at the falls. You've got the Fall River. You've got the Deerfield River and the major Connecticut River. I'm leaving out a whole bunch of them, but the point is, that this was a place of plenty, and it was a place that the approaches to the falls and to this area was a zone of security. It was safe. Like I always tell people, and like Joe does, you left your issues at the door. So this was an area where there was very low conflict. It was overseen and stewarded by the Pocumtuck, who welcomed the visitors. So if you can picture people coming down the Connecticut from the various nations of the Abenaki lands, but people coming from the coast, people coming up the river, it was just a place of convergence, especially at planting time and at fish run time. So maybe we should go to the next slide and we can come back if we need to. Yeah, I guess this is good right now because there's well, try another one forward. I'll come back to this one. I got another map that Joe has in small here, but one more. Go ahead. One more. Yeah. Okay. So, can you get oriented here? And I've got copies if somebody needs that. I can get you one. But this is fascinating. We mentioned this man who wrote, along with another white antiquarian who wrote the history of Northfield, also wrote the history of Deerfield and many other fields. And he is responsible for this map in the 1870s. So what George Sheldon of Deerfield wanted to do in his Pocumtuck Valley Memorial Association of historians, he wanted to remember, before somebody forgot, the names, the Indian names of this area. So this is Northfield, Squaw Creek, and this goes down to Montreal, okay? So if you could start getting oriented. So he had at least the merit of recording the names, or trying to revive the names. This guy Sheldon was fascinating. I guide in his house, and sometimes I feel like I'm talking to him because he did some pretty atrocious stuff too. George Sheldon, there's been Sheldons in Deerfield and Greenfield since the very first colonials showed up. But Sheldon was one of these people. He lived to be almost 100. He was one of these people born in 1818, and he was somebody who collected everything, wrote everything down, scavenged, saved. He created a museum. It's still down there, the PVMA Museum in Deerfield. But he interviewed all of the elders, and if you can picture, maybe he was hitting his prime in the 1840s, and so he would be talking to grandparents who were maybe born in the late 1700s, who knew stories from their grandparents. So at the very least, he wrote a lot of this down. His issue that we have against him is that he wrote about Native Americans as though they were all dead and gone. The erasure, what we call an erasure of tribal presence, which we are denying and proving that it's not the case, can't be. But anyway, George Sheldon, he did write a 400-page book about the history of Deerfield, and a good third of it is what you would call the Indian stories. He has names you wouldn't believe. I mean, you've never heard of them. I've got a few in my collection here, I'll show you in a minute. But Sheldon, at the very least, preserved a lot of that. And you read the history of Northfield, and you can get some really good information. So anyway, he put together this map with his friends, and you have Squawkee, which is now known as Northfield, but it was also in Abenaki, was Sokwakik, meaning the place of the people who separated. And you come down the river, and the way they wrote it was Connecticut. So what I used in my bio was the Nipmuc name for it, because the Nipmuc people are still here, and they're the ones who gave it that name. Other tribes, the Abenaki, give it a way different spelling. It still comes out to sort of like Connecticut, but depending on the alphabet. So then you come down the river and you come to here, which is a Pequog River, which is my river. My house is right there on that little curve. It's right there. It's so easy to identify even from outer space. My great-grandfather came here. He was a mixed race Narragansett, Nahantic, white and black. And so, but this was right after the Civil War, and there was your history, there was a period of tolerance basically after the Civil War. 1870 till when the Klan rose up in 1900, so about 30 years of, in my family genealogy, a lot of people from Greenfield, mixed marriages. No problem. My great-grandfather's sister married a white guy, and they had a whole bunch of children whose descendants are still here in Greenfield, so it's pretty fascinating. But anyway, I lived there, and these little symbols, obviously, these are places where people lived. We called this wigwams, right? A teepee is out on the plains. In the northeast, it's a wigwam, and also a wetu. Wetu were kind of the rounded dome things, so you've got two names to play with, but don't call them teepees. And so you come down here, and what I find fascinating is the falls here he called Squamscut. He didn't call it Peskiomscut, although an English person might have made a mistake. And English are not really good with languages, and so you should see what they've done to some like Irish towns. They're just whatever, but just whatever it sounds like. But Squamscut. So Squamscut, in what I've been told by the Abenaki, is that it's a good fishing place. Squamscut. However, Pesk has something to do with a rock. So even Sheldon says, well, it could be Pescatuk, it could be Pescaomscut, it could be Pesquamscut, so these names are in the lexicon here. And I always tell people, you've got to learn the Indian names of those rivers because they will answer to their names. And that's part of what we're doing, is trying to find those names, find them back. Sheldon and Pressey of the history of Montague found names, Indian names for the islands in the Connecticut River.
Yeah.
And it's really important to know those names. That's what they were called for 10,000 years. And then somebody came along and decided he would call it My Island, Rollins Island, or Smead Island. Well, what was the real name? They'll answer to their names. So you come down here, Sugarloaf. Now, whoever decided it should be called Sugarloaf? Its real name is Weequahirs, where the land drops off. And we got quite a story, if you haven't heard that one yet, about what that's all about. It basically means the hill that is dry. So, but it sounds great in the native language. And so you've got Pocumtuck River. You've got, what is this one, Joe? Joe knows this river very.
Pocumtuck.
Mm-hmm. Pocumtuck.
The boring river, not because you'd fall asleep if you were to watch it flow, but because it's a river that liked to change its course a lot, and when it did, it would burrow into the bankings, where I used to catch these incredible brown trout when I was growing up. I grew up on it.
So can you imagine what river that is? Dorothy lives on the banks.
The green.
That's her address, her river address is Pocumtuck or Pocumtuck, the Green River. And it has a meaning. I'd have to check to see what it is, but it means
Boring
something.
river.
Yeah. What is this? Sunset. That is GCC right here, and right behind it, as you start going up, it's Sunset, Stony Place. But anyway, so you can see what I'm getting at. There's just so many things to remember and to learn.
The recorder, a week and a half ago, Chalk Shell Bridge.
Yeah.
You might have read about it. My vote was Patchogue and Sasquatchie. That's what I wanted to see the bridge called. But everybody felt that Shell ought to get in there because he built the bridge, and they're going to tear it down, but maybe people would come to see what had replaced it. But anyways, Patchogue, the crossing place, the clear water in the crossing place. And Nolambika, Wabanaki name for the calm waters below the upper rapids and above the lower rapids, the safe place, the calm waters, Nolambika. These names have powerful meanings.
Yes.
Do we have any idea about brooks? These are all larger bodies of water, the rivers, but do we have any ideas about names of brooks or smaller bodies of water?
I haven't. I've got a map that was just wound up in my hands. You know how that happens sometimes? You don't know what you're doing. And
Yep.
all of a sudden, how did this book get here? Well,
Yep.
it just happened to me. Someone put a map that was researched of this area with more detail than this. So next time, I've got it enlarged. It's just I didn't bring it tonight. But, and it might have that. It's challenging. It's challenging to find small bodies of water.
But other landmarks too, the larger landmarks would have definitely been named, correct?
Yeah.
I think the smaller streams had their location.
Oh, yeah.
And many of them have been occupied for long periods of time because the landscape that surrounds them, what we call ceremonial stone landscapes, is really quite evident. And I mean, I know where there's a whale on 4 Mile Brook,
Mm-hmm.
the whale stone. It kind of lets you know that the whale was pretty important, and these people were walkers. So if they lived on the coast but came up here for the summers, anyways, the landscape lets you know that the people knew these places really well and held them in high esteem. And they built ceremonial stone landscapes in it. I mean, the solstice is a prime example. The Pilgrims spent a week and a half offshore because they wanted to wait for winter solstice so they could come ashore without any resistance. It's because they knew the tribal people were going to be celebrating winter solstice. People don't realize that, so, but we want to talk about the airport real quick, don't we, and about,
Yeah, let's back up. How much time do you want us to take? Because we could go all night.
We have only about 10 minutes, but if people are feeling comfortable, we'll go 10 more minutes after that.
well, why don't we see how close we can get to telling this?
Yeah.
Relevant
Yeah.
to the ceremonial hill to this Falls
Yeah.
Airport.
Well, let's backtrack. I want to do 2 place name things, and then we can backtrack 2 slides, 1 more. Okay, so anyway, place names, native people living here. You've heard of Mount Tom. Where did that come from? It comes from that long word, Kamheganomska, meaning the place where you get tomahawk rock. So it's not some Major Tom out there. It was a shortened word because English didn't want to say the whole long thing. But that's the origin of Mount Tom. You probably have heard of Quabog, which is out Quabbin area. The Nipmuc, of course, are close friends of ours, and they're still here, have been here ever since the first Paleo people came in. Nipmuc are the freshwater people. This is what I was telling you about Sokokiak. This, Pemawachu Watung, the Pocumtuck Range. In other words, the extension from Mount Sugarloaf up to the falls. Sachem's Head, Poet's Seat Tower, that whole ridge line had a name.
What is that one?
This is the long winding hill. Okay. Wequamps is Sugarloaf, Conquachu, Connecticut, Peskionska, place where the rock divides the river, or the place where the rock fire bursts out. Wissatinawag, Canada Hill, place of mist and shining rocks. Wachusett at the medium-sized mountain. Wantastiga, Brattleboro. So all these places had names. Can we, just want to take 5 minutes between Joe and I to talk about the major event, historical event that happened here, which was the King Philip's War part. So I think we should talk about that so that you all know at least some of the basics, because Joe and I worked on the study, 6-year study with anthropologists and tribal people, and to try to get to the bottom of what that was all about. So like I said, we could talk for a long time, but essentially if you can picture the Pilgrims showing up in 1620, Massasoit, or the Abenaki would say Massasoit. Go figure, that accent placement helped the English survive. Then his son, 40 years later, Philip, or Metacomet, did everything he could to drive the English back into the ocean. So in one generation, the last chance of the people in the Northeast would have ridden on the shoulders of Metacomet. English dubbed him King Philip. And there's a story behind that. So that particular war, Flashpoint happened in 1675. You can read all about what triggered it, but there was a lot of back and forth, and then finally, boom. So Philip came out of the Pokanoket tribe, which is basically the Wampanoag, and he gathered as many people as he could, and they burned down a good third of what we call New England, and including, there was nothing here in Greenfield at the time, but Deerfield was the northernmost outpost. That was burned down. Northfield had attempted to be settled by white people. That was burned down. Brookfield, Wheeler's Surprise, all that was gone. Springfield was burned. Providence, Rhode Island, gone. And a lot of towns that you might recognize, Lancaster, and on and on. So, I'm going real fast, but I want you to get the context. So, Philip was alone fighting. He did get the Nipmuc to join him. Massasoit, his mother was a Nipmuc, so when Massasoit left, retired, and turned it over to his son Philip. Philip inherited that because his older brother died mysteriously coming home from the English home one night. So Philip got the Nipmuc to join him. Then the English did a really stupid thing. They attacked the Narragansetts. The Narragansetts were the most powerful tribe, probably 4,000 or 5,000 armed men. And the Narragansetts did not want to get involved. But the English attacked the Narragansett fort in December and massacred a whole lot of people, but a lot of people escaped. Where did they go? They went to the falls. They went to Northfield, Squakeek, and they went to what we now know as Turner's Falls. So you had several thousand people trying to survive in December, January, February up in Joe's front yard, and it was really harsh. And so both sides, the English and the Indians, had basically beaten themselves silly, and nobody was winning, and there was confusion. Plymouth, Massachusetts Bay were kind of negotiating with certain tribes. Hartford and Haven, the other rival faction to Massachusetts Bay, they were negotiating. A lot of confusion. And what occurred then was, after surviving up in Northfield through the winter, they came down to the falls to fish and to plant, perform ceremony. I always liked, way back when we were fighting for this grant, Joe said they came to the falls to get protein. Now that's really basically what was going on. They were starving. And so the tribal people, I feel, the warriors being honorable warriors, they set themselves up in camps. And the women, the elderly, and the women and children were in a different place. Any honorable adversary would attack an honorable adversary. They're not going to go and massacre children, non-combatants, but that's what they did. So they avoided, in this study, we know that Turner, who was a Baptist, just got out of prison in Boston, a Puritan prison. He was released. He was 63. He was sick. And we got a letter saying, I don't want to do this. I want to go home. But they had him in a tight spot. He said he would do it in exchange for getting a church in Boston and having the Baptists accept it. So basically, Turner was assigned to Northampton, and the inevitable happened. He led a group of 150 men up to the falls. They avoided all the soldiers' camps. There would be one at the mouth of the Deerfield. There was one on Canada Hill. There was one on the island, 2 on the islands. There was one in what we call Unity Park now. He slalomed all through that, came up past Cherry Rum Plaza, following the White Ash Swamp, dropped down over Factory Hollow, and at dawn attacked the non-combatants camp and killed about 400 people. They either jumped in the river, swept over the falls, or they were, Joe told the story, I mean, they decided they would save their powder, and they just started using swords and knives. So it was pretty bad. And
They were
then,
getting no resistance, you see, that's why.
and Turner, some of the men, especially a young man, 16, named Jonathan Wells, lingered too long in the camp, looting and stealing stuff. And so they gave the tribal people time to counterattack, and so they began chasing those attackers all the way back the way they came. They went down Silver Street, past Stop and Shop, and past the Greenfield High School, down to the Greenfield swimming pool where Turner was killed. And so we've been studying that for 6 years. We've got information, detail, stuff left over from that attack. Interestingly, they found 600 musket balls with their metal detectors, and most of them were being fired from the east to the west. In other words, the English were trying to get out of there as best they could, and the natives were heavily armed. These were not bow and arrow stuff. They had that, but they had what would go for contemporary modern rifles, supplied by the Dutch, supplied by the French, and also picked up on the battlefield. So anyway, you know, we tell it and we know they went through past where the Mackin Sandbank is, past Canada Hill, past Stop and Shop, down Silver Street and over, and then did the best they could to get down Green River and over across into the Deerfield Meadows, but with native people chasing them all the way. The English
Cutting
only,
them off.
yep, the English only knew one way in and one way out. So the tribal people living here for thousands of years, they knew they like the back of their hand. So they knew the English were going to follow the meanders of Cherry Run Brook. So, like Joe said, they knew there was a meander here, right out past Greenfield Country Club. So they'd be sitting there waiting for the English to show up, and then when there was a skirmish, and the English would keep following the brook, and the tribes would cut across the land and just wait for them to show up, and then another skirmish. So, and they found all these musket balls left over from those. They've been in the ground for 350 plus years.
We could show you the hills where the indigenous people were probably standing behind trees firing down, because the advantage is always the high ground.
Yeah.
Right.
You know, it's just amazing that history lingered, but it did. There it is. It tells the story.
So that, I mean, in broad strokes, that's what, and you can read that in the Town of Montague website, the story of the battle. You'd have to look under grants or battlefield or something like that. But anyway, that's what we've been studying for a long time, and we've turned up a lot of new information that is all recorded there. But that tended to be the turning point, but that happened here. People were running down these streets of Greenfield, heading for Deerfield. And eventually, what occurred after that was a lot of the land in Deerfield and this part here was traded away by various native individuals, some of them who had no right to do that. But John Pynchon was busy collecting land and deeds and all of that. So just, I mean, like I said, there's so much that we have learned, and you know, you can read books, but you need people like Joe and me to tell you, because I think it's oral history. This is the way it happens. And all of these people have a point of view and a bias. Right now, I think we don't have too many biases here. If we did, you know where they're coming from, but we're trying, as historians, we're trying to get a full picture. And so that study was encompassed and overseen by a panel made up of 5 historical commissioners and 4 native tribes. And we all sat at a table once a month for 6 years. And we worked over all these details. And the tribal people could tell the archaeologists something that they didn't know. And could, you know, they had the science, but the tribal people had the perspective, depth of history and explanation as to why this happened right there. So it's just been incredible. And we've met a lot of people. Those tribal people are close friends. And,
Fine people.
So anyway, sorry to push the boundaries, but I thought it would not be right if we didn't tell you, because we want you to know about what happened here and how a tribal people lived here for 10,000 years and had names for all these places, including the brooks and the hills and, the beginning of Mohawk Trail, Sunset. So, wow, where did that come from? Never heard that name before. So basically, I'll turn it over to Joe, because I've talked myself out. Thank you for being patient. And I know we're running out of time, but we take 5 minutes for questions if you want. Or
Yeah, why don't we just do some questions? We're running tight.
Yeah, let me just, yes, questions, wait a second. First of all, thank you. And thank you all for coming. And starting off Echo in a really nice way. This is really nice for us. Thank you very much. And what I really like it, if you would all do as audience, is think of the questions that have been brought to your head today through this. And think about one that you might want to spend the summer investigating and searching. You don't have to commit to that. You don't have to, you can write it down and hang it on the wall if you want. But just right now, right in this space while we have these thoughts, think about questions that you might have that you would want to investigate. I'm going to give you each a copy of our frequently asked questions and our calendar of events that we're going to follow this through, and you know, we're inventing it as we go along, so there may be some way to bring those questions all back together and some of the resources that, like Joe and David, and be together and have some interactive stuff about answering questions. So, to start off with, does anybody at the end here have a question for Joe or David that they'd like to ask before we run away? And I will hand out these. And really, thank you for coming. This is really fun for us. Go ahead. Does anybody, you got Carol? Were you?
Oh, I did. Thank you. So I'm understanding that archaeology played a great. Had an objection for digging up land in certain areas, or was that not an issue?
Yeah, that was articulated early on about, number one, they being present for the archaeology, and number two, what was off limits. And sacred or ceremonial stuff was off limits. And so that wasn't really a problem. The story of what happened to the people was pretty important, and they were very respectful. But one thing David didn't tell you was each of the tribal people wrote a narrative and submitted it to be part of the ongoing record for this body of research, so that when somebody anywhere in the world decides they want to start studying about King Philip's War, Metacomet's War, you will have living tribal representation of their oral traditions and how they felt about things, and it really filters through a lens, a tribal lens, whatever the science says. You put it and you filter it through those narratives that we have on record, and all of a sudden you get the chance to step and look at it from a different angle. Very, very interesting. I mean, everybody wants to know why Philip died where he died. And, you know, there's a lot of stories there.
Yeah. Two quick stories is that, for example, and Joe and I did this together. So, if you heard what he said, we fought, didn't have to fight to convince too many people, but we had to maintain the demand that the tribal people would write their own story and that nobody was going to synthesize it or edit it. They just had, and you can see those stories. One of the heart-wrenching stories was the Nipmuc. So the Nipmuc are the people who are the closest related to the Wakamtuk. They're here. They're still here. And all these place names are Nipmuc names for 90% of the ones in our area. So the place names are important. What I'm getting at is that in order to write their narrative, 3 elders from the Nipmuc tribe said, we can't do that until we go here, go there, go to Turner's Falls. And so the woman sachem brought the 3 elders, 3 ladies who were in their late 70s, early 80s, mid 80s, who had never been here. And they wanted to see the place before they could say something. And so, first thing, we took them. We took them to, you can imagine how heart-wrenching that was. And we were on the site in Riverside, looking at the river. And all of these ladies were saying, this is so beautiful here. I can't believe it. I want to come back, bring my children and my grandchildren. They have to see this. And so that was really good. And then we took them to Canada Hill, and they sensed what was in the ground, and they were overwhelmed. Joe and I had to walk away so
They had
that
to give them some space.
they could find the words to pray. And then what they produced was the heart-wrenching part, is they basically said, we didn't mean to, but we forgot. We forgot the story of what happened here. I think it's for two reasons. One is that it was really bad, and over the generations, nobody brought it up anymore. The second thing is, what I and Joe agree on, is that the land tells you the stories. They could not be on the land anymore. They lost what the hills told them. They lost what the rivers would tell them. They didn't write things down. They heard stories. Wissatinawag told them something. The Great Falls told them something. And they told those stories, and they were disassociated from the land. So those stories were lost. They didn't know anything about it. Our friend David White, Tall Pine White, said, no, there's nothing. He was looking for the documentation. There was nothing in the archives of the tribe. There's nothing in the history books. So that was really important. And I think, Jay, everybody who loves stories and can tell stories, the land tells you the story. And if you're not, you now know some of the place names around you, and that these places will answer to their Indian names. But it's so important to keep the river in mind, and keep the hill in mind, and keep that swamp in mind, because that tells a story. The other thing is about the archaeology and the connection. The tribal people, backed up by Joe and me, wanted and kept telling the anthropologists, archaeologists, you've got to have a native voice in this report. What are the native voices? We know that you went to UConn and you got your doctorate, and you went to Harvard and you got your doctorate. That's one thing. But this is a whole other perspective. And they didn't have a problem with that, but they did, by us repeating it, they would, of their own accord, say, oh yeah, we've got to have a native voice in this. Jonathan, what do you think of this? And it really worked. And we're still working on it. We got suspended because of COVID, but we're going to go back in the fall and pick up where we left off. 6 years of this. One of the advisory board people was a descendant of one of the white settlers who was a participant in the massacre. And he was still carrying a burden. And it wasn't guilt, it was anger. And Joe, I don't know if you were there that time, but that particular person got in the face of one of our Indian representatives. Got it, here we are, 350 years later or more, and still, well, why you They got into it over the Bloody Brook Massacre. Well, you killed all our men. Well, you stole our corn. Well, you burned our houses down. Wait a minute, you people, this really was at that level. So, I was the chairman. I said, what do I do? I'm going to break it up or let it go? I said, no, let them do it. Let's just get it over with, So they did, and they blew it out of their system, and Doug Harris held his own, and I won't mention his name, but a charming gentleman from Greenfield, he held his own. And then they wound up shaking hands and patting each other on the back. But they had to spit it out.
Yeah, they had to get it out.
But this is living history. These are citizens talking about history and learning history. Why do you do that? You want to know stuff. You want to know where you're living. What are the stories that are here? So anyway, that's your connection between the archaeology and the native people.
Thank you.
If people need to leave, they should feel But we're not gonna close the door till 9, so if people wanna sit and talk, that's cool too.
Oh, well, whatever, whatever is legal and correct.
So is there a story about Sachem's Head?
Do you know anything about that?
What's that now?
Sachem's Head?
I don't know enough detail about it. Mary Kellogg, I think there's something in the Greenfield Library, yeah, about it. And just, again, like David said, the land will speak. You just have to listen. And if you can think about how wild that area was, and there's a cave up there, and it's a high vantage point, and it's on what I would consider sacred ground. The details specific, I can't remember.
I do have an old dictionary of place names, and I'll look into it. I'll see if I've got it, and I'll see you again. I'll see if I can find that, but it's always intrigued me too. I don't know, what the background would be.
I found some rock formations in the Highland Park and in that area that intrigued me before I found out that this was something that was being researched. I have a picture probably in my phone.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you could show me next time we get together, because we're going to get together, right? Nina and I are going to play at the Energy Park on July 1st.
All right, now that you've said that, we better get together, because I haven't played with you in so
better
long.
practice.
Oh, God, you got more talent than anybody I know.
So anyway,
This story is really an amazing story, the history that's in the land. I like to think about it as, so I'm given this life, and I don't know how much time I'm given to be here on this earth. But I wake up asking myself, am I a good ancestor? And I also wake up in the morning and say, are you willing to listen today? And that's pretty important. And Henry David Thoreau was once asked, oh, how do you find all these artifacts? And because he had quite an artifact collection, he was an admirer of the local indigenous people. He said, I don't find them, they find me, and that is the God's honest truth. And books are like that. They are. They'll find you. If you put the energy out there, they'll find you. And the stories in the land are the same. Now, I grew up on the Green River. I fished it, I walked it, I swam in it, and I sat there and mused about the world on the banks of the Pacamigan, the Green River. And that river has told me amazing stories, and I wish I had time to tell you an amazing story, but I really don't, because it deserves a story unto itself about that river. But so, what's that? We'll have to come back. Yeah. So that's, I say, I like to breathe the air. I want to know what's in the air I'm breathing. I like to walk on the land. I want to know what the story of the land is. I just feel like you can have all the money in the bank accounts in the world you want. If you want to be rich in the mind and the heart, and you are sitting on top of the world. And when you walk through history and you be rich like that, God, it makes life so exciting. It's just, I say, how blessed can a person be? To learn, to listen, and realize that we are here because of 1,000 generations before us. And they had lives to live, and they had stories to tell. And I truly believe that in each of us, there is what I call genetic cellular memory. When I see the sun rise in the east through a pine grove and turn those green needles yellow, a whole world opens up inside of me. I have been there before. I have seen this stuff before. When I smell pine smoke, my life goes back from before I was born in 49. So cellular memory, genetic cellular memory, I believe it's a real thing. And I think as science progresses enough, they may be able to prove parts of that at some point in time. but history is here. And it's not blasé, it's rich. It includes sacrifice, it includes joy, it includes sorrow, it includes just so many things. And when we did some ceremony on Wissatinniwag, we each got to speak, those of us that were doing this private ceremony, and I said, I hear the children laughing. I hear the people enjoying each other. I hear the cries and I hear the sorrow. It's all here. It's all what makes up a human life, and it's all there. It's all available. You kind of got to take cotton out of your ears, and you got to wipe the sweat out of your eyes, and you got to look around, and the nose and the everything. You hear, listen, look.
As you speak, Joe, it just feels more and more to me that it's a real spiritual experience. Just that it can't help but touch that spiritual part that is in all of us that maybe we haven't yet recognized or completely embraced.
Henry David Thoreau again said, "Let no man stand between me and my God." And my God, in my case, are the wind and the water and the sun and the moon and my ancestors and all the wild things that bring me so much joy. That's my God. And you know, being raised a Catholic and trying to muddle my way through that, I started to wake up later in life and say, God, Henry was right. Let no man stand between me and my God. And we have all these riches available to us in knowledge. And that could be just talking to an old person and being willing to truly listen to what they tell you. My father sat on the porch where he was raised on Beach Street in Greenfield and listened to Grandpa Sears, who was a veteran of World War II. He had silver hair down to his elbows. Sit there and talk about his life experience. Civil War, my father talked to a Civil War vet when he was a young man, and he listened. And when he was alive, he went to Grandpa Sears' grave and always placed a flag there for him.
You also remind me, you used the expression old-timers earlier tonight, and that in my own research, I find some of the most useful information is when these old-timers would write back. They had lived in Greenfield in their early years. They remembered Greenfield from the 1840s. And then many years later, they write back of those memories. And there are so many little clues there for us to see what life was like in this town then.
This town.
So the old timers are worth listening to.
Yeah, they really are. They didn't have the whole story necessarily, but if you can gather enough of those stories together, you can really get a sense of that time and that space. And I'm glad we got the chance this evening to just scratch the surface, because really what David and I would love to talk about would take a lot of these sessions.
Yeah, we could, I
We
warn you
really
all, we
could.
could go on for hours.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much.